A very good morning to you. It's Tuesday, the 14th of July, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. And great to be joined again by Nat Yoannidis. How are you, Nat?
Yeah, pretty good, Pete. Of course, it's a little bit cold down here in Melbourne and we are in lockdown, but overall not too bad.
So no excuse in lockdown, of course, to not be up bright and early this morning, reading all the newspapers and getting all the best scoops ready to give to you guys, the listeners and watchers of the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. The premise is simple. Less than 15 minutes, 5 massive stories, and we'll go through them, a couple of minutes for each of them. Worth noting as well, a couple of big stories not making the cut this morning. There's heaps happening, nothing perhaps bigger that didn't make the cut than Manchester City being successful in their appeal in the Court of Arbitration for Sport, so they will compete in next season's Champions League. But Nat, we're going to start things here in Australia, and quite a phenomenal piece, phenomenal in terms of the impact it might have in the Australian today from their sports editor, Wally Mason, talking about Super Rugby AU. The title of the op-ed is "Forget Winning Your Coronavirus Survival Competition. Let's Bring Back the Excitement." Mason doesn't pull any punches here. He doesn't hold back. Basically, nobody cares who wins Super Rugby AU. We don't really care who wins this weekend's games. It's a made-up competition and a holding pattern competition. No one gives a rat's who wins it. What we want to do, though, is we want to be entertained, make it watchable rugby, running, passing, tackling, tries, and make television executives want to broadcast it next year. Nat, do the current Australian teams and players have an obligation to showcase the more exciting elements of the game for the sake of its commercial future?
Well, no, because a lot of jobs are at stake, Pete. So obviously you don't want to just be, throwing caution to the wind when you've got coaches that are, playing or, these games could potentially determine their future. But then on the flip side, if you are looking from the outside, which I'm assuming that Mason certainly is in this regard, and you're not the rugby purist, then you would be thinking, then what does Australian rugby have to lose? They've introduced all these new rules for this Super Rugby AU competition. Of course, we've got the 50-22 rule, we've got less time in scrum resets, and of course we also have our new golden point situation, which we saw on the weekend against the Rebels and the Reds. So Rugby Australia is certainly introducing rules to try and make this a little bit more exciting, and that's certainly what they want, because as you've already mentioned, rugby doesn't have a broadcast partner for next year, so it is integral that they do get the eyes of the broadcasters and really do make this competition quite exciting. So I can completely understand where this article is going from. As for the rugby purists, though, they might not necessarily agree. But as a fan, you do want to see something a little bit more exciting.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges for rugby, expanding their audience, talking to new markets as opposed to just those purists. As Mason points out, average ball in time play, about 30 minutes per 80 minutes in rugby union compared to 60 in 80 for rugby league. Interesting to see what happens this weekend. Western Force against the Reds on Friday night. We moved from rugby union over stateside with the huge news that the Washington Redskins will drop their name. They're yielding to pressure from sponsors and activists, as written by Ken Belson in the New York Times. They only announced a review a few days ago, and now that they've announced they will no longer be the Washington Redskins, one of the most famous brands in world sport. Should organisations like the Redskins be praised for making these tough calls, even if it's taken longer than it should have? And are we going to see the likes of not only the Kansas City Chiefs, the Chicago Blackhawks, Cleveland Indians and Atlanta Braves in the US, but also England's Exeter Chiefs and Rugby Union join them in dropping these Native American names?
To be perfectly honest, it is amazing that it has taken this long for the Redskins to change their name, because it's such a derogatory term. It is a racist term, let's be perfectly honest. With the Chiefs, the Black Hawk, thing like that, a little bit less so, but I do understand where you're coming from. But the Redskins was the big one. That was the one that needed to change now, as particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement going on in the US. So it's incredibly timely. So it is great to see, even though it is probably a little bit later than you would expect. So I think that in this regards, the Redskins certainly need to be applauded, because as we've seen in the United States, of course, the right, Donald Trump's side of politics is certainly very vocal over in the States at the moment. Political correctness isn't necessarily the main thing going on over in the United States. So this is a huge call for the Redskins, particularly at this time, but it's certainly the right call. Whether or not we see the Chiefs, as you've already mentioned, change their name. Of course, we also had the Crusaders in Super Rugby just last year discussing whether or not they should be changing their name after those shootings in Christchurch. So, of course, there's always going to be debate over whether or not a team should change their name if it does have some sort of historical reference or if there is some seemingly racist reference. But the Redskins was without doubt a derogatory term and needed to be changed.
And it's going to cost that organisation millions of dollars to rebrand, obviously already on the back of coronavirus and that impact that that's had on revenue for sporting teams, at least in the case of the NFL. No disruption to games thus far. Our third story today, and our big one that we're going to spend a little bit more time on, is a cracking column from Greg Baum in The Age, talking about shorter games, short-changing footy. There's been a lot of debate about what AFL football's like to watch at the moment. We've seen Alistair Clarkson, Luke Beveridge, Damien Hardwick, John Longmire, some of the game's best and most successful coaches wade into this conversation, talking about negative football, about the way it's being umpired and officiated, the way in which teams are coping with a defensive first mindset. Greg Baum saying that it's actually the shortened quarters that were put in place this year. Of course, 20% shorter quarters, down to 16 minutes as a result of COVID and the possibility of short turnaround matches. That's the number one influence on uglier style of football being played in 2020. Do you agree with that?
I think that you could argue that the only thing that shorter quarters really impacts is the number of goals kicked. It shouldn't mean that there's only 2 or 3 goals kicked by a team in a match, which we saw in that game against Richmond and Sydney. I sat down and watched that game, and it was excruciating to watch. It was really, really difficult. But then that was followed up by the Carlton game against the Western Bulldogs, and that was exhilarating. It was so much fun to watch the Blues really just hit their strides in what is such a bizarre season in the AFL. So I think that you could use the shorter quarters as an excuse for the number of goals that are being kicked. As for the ugly style of football, there's really no excuse. I understand that the players have had a disrupted preparation. That's certainly going to play into things, and that might be one of the reasons that AFL coaches do have a more defensive mindset, because as they say, defence starts win your premierships. It always has. So whether or not that's something that's coming into play, but I don't think you can argue that the shorter quarters is making football ugly. One thing that you could say, though, is that there needs to be a little bit more consistency in the umpiring, because AFL is the only sport from around the world that seems to change its rules every single week. Interpretations, particularly on holding the ball, as we saw this week, incorrect disposal. Most of the time, fans don't know what the rules are. Players don't know what the rules are. There was one situation where a player was pinned for running the ball through the goals. One of the defenders was pinned for running the ball through the goals, despite having a player putting pressure on him. Now, up until this week, if you've got a player that's putting pressure on or putting a tackle on, that wouldn't necessarily be deemed deliberate. In this situation, it was. So the interpretations just keep changing so often in the rules. And I think that, if anything, that's the biggest blight on the game at the moment.
And we know the reason that the 16-minute quarters were brought in was because we're going to see teams on 4-5-day turnarounds. Teams are in hubs, so they're not necessarily going to have the opportunity to rotate 10, 15 players through. There's no VFL competition taking place. So if you're not playing in the first team, you're not playing at the moment. So it has been put in from a player welfare perspective. I think that's an extremely valid point about the way that the game is umpired, changing from week to week. We've seen this week the focus being on the kick travelling the required 15 metres, the directives from within the umpiring department to look at a different rule every single week, certainly unique to that game. We're going to move to the NRL now. Huge news for the Canterbury Bulldogs in a couple of senses. We won't touch too much on reports that Dean Pay, their head coach, is set to stand down this morning. We'll wait for that to be official and perhaps speak about that one with Jim Tucker tomorrow. But really massive news with the NRL Court of Appeals reinstating the contracts of 2 players who were terminated earlier this year, Jayden Okombor and Corey Harawira-Naera. They were terminated earlier this year after a consensual sexual engagement with a schoolgirl on a community-based camp during the pre-season. essentially suggesting that they had abused the influence on the young lady involved despite it being consensual and legal. They were initially terminated, but the Court of Appeal has now turned that around. Hawaranira is suspended for 10 matches, fined $15,000. Jaden Okombor, his ban now is 14 games and $22,500. With time served, both players could be back inside the next 6 weeks, whether that's at the Bulldogs, who now have to decide whether to terminate them and possibly go down that legal process themselves, or whether that be at other clubs who apparently are queuing up for these two players. Nat, does this show that the punishment was too harsh initially, or is this the wrong call to reinstate these players?
I don't think that the punishment was too harsh initially. It was a terrible look for the game, of course. I mean, when you consider, think about it, they had a sexual relationship with a schoolgirl while they were on a camp, while they were involved with the Bulldogs. They were there for work. That is an awful look for the game, and it's really quite disgusting when you do think about it. I don't think that the penalty was too harsh. I think that it's really disappointing that it's been overturned so quickly. I mean, at the time, there was no football going on. It was the one thing that was making news, and the NRL felt that they needed to act swiftly and harshly, which they did, because the public outcry was rightfully quite extreme. Now, football's back. There's a lot more to be distracted by, and all of a sudden we're seeing that these penalties are being lessened. You already mentioned that there's news that there's reports that Dean Pay may be stepping down from his role as coach of the Bulldogs this week. You can guarantee that that's going to take centre stage over something like this. So the way I'm reading it is that there's less public scrutiny at the moment. So this has been overturned, and I think that that is incredibly disappointing.
We're going to stick with rugby league for our final story today, and it comes from Michael Chammas in the Sydney Morning Herald. And they've done the NRL's annual players poll through Nine Media. In conjunction with NRL.com, they polled 150 players from all 16 clubs to get their responses about a range of topics. Part one in today's newspaper talks about the players anointing the best player in each position and a few different other things from a player's perspective. We can look at who the best player is in the NRL, and Cameron Smith's reign as the best player in the NRL is over, with James Tedesco claiming almost half of the votes this year. Jason Taumalolo leapfrogged Smith into second place, with Smith in third. And it might seem a strange approach to take, but I actually want to talk about how phenomenal and remarkable it is that Cameron Smith, as a 37-year-old, has only just now been overtaken as the best player in the competition. Is that something we actually often acknowledge often enough?
Probably not. I mean, I think that most people would have said that James Tedesco is the best player in the competition at the moment. He is such a phenomenal player. And as you mentioned, Cameron Smith, 37. I mean, down here in Melbourne, of course, we love Cameron Smith. He's probably one of the only players that your average or your casual NRL fan would actually know from the Melbourne Storm or from the NRL competition as a whole. He's been such a stalwart of this club for such a long period of time. But yeah, it is a real testament to just how highly he's regarded. When you consider as well that there is always seems to be this media obsession with taking down Cameron Smith, particularly coming from Sydney, whether it is that he's influencing the referees or whatever it is, there always seems to be a bit of a Cameron Smith, an anti-Cameron Smith bias. But it is so interesting to notice that the players respect him so highly, even though he is closing in on 40 and, of course, played over 400 games. But, yeah, it is very interesting when you consider it from that perspective.
And Smith voted as the competition's best captain by his peers. Craig Bellamy, I should say, pipped for the best coach by Trent Robinson, but coming in second place there. Nat, it's been fantastic to catch up and go through all of these big stories this morning. Before I let you go, what's your one to watch in the world of sport?
I don't know if it's so much one to watch, but more a story that really has captured the imagination of the sporting public just overnight. Sam Stosur announcing that her and her partner have had a baby. That's so exciting for Sam Stosur. Of course, she has been much maligned by the Australian public, particularly when she is playing at home. Of course, her failures at the Australian Open have been well documented. Do we see Sam Stosur come back and play tennis at that top level? I think that she is such a competitor. She is so fit that she'll certainly be coming back to play when tennis does resume on the international stage eventually. But it is so nice to see that there is some news, some lovely news out of the Stosur camp. Such a difficult time in many people's lives.
Yeah, well said. Congratulations to Sam and the entire family. Nat, fantastic to catch up. Look forward to seeing you again soon. You've been watching or listening to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you again tomorrow.